The rain was still in my hair when I stepped through my parents' front doors, light spilling from a crystal chandelier that made the marble floor glare like ice, and my voice tripped over the words I had rehearsed in the car. Music drifted in from the engagement party, laughing toasts, forks against china, and I followed my mother's eyes as they skimmed the drops rolling off my coat. My father guided me into his study, without looking at me, long the way you move a wet umbrella out of a room you want to keep pristine. I told them Lila had collapsed at school, that the ER lights were too bright, and that the cardiologist's deadline sounded like a clock running down in a quiet house. My mother smoothed the pearls at her neck. My father checked the time. I asked them to help us bridge the cost of surgery scheduled within 48 hours because nothing else had worked and nothing else mattered. Someone laughed on the other side of the door, and the sound landed like a knock. My hands would not stop shaking. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to keep your voice calm while the most important part of your life was slipping out of reach. My name is Nora Bennett, and I was raised in a house where the floors never squeaked and the curtains were always pressed, where you learned very early that silence could carry a message better than words. Richard and Elaine Palmer built their lives on careful planning and careful friends, and they taught us to smile for photographs, even when the flash burned our eyes. I learned other lessons in a different place at a library desk, where the lamp ran hot and the pages smelled like dust at an art table, where color felt like air, and later in cheap apartments where the paint peeled, but hope stayed put. I left for college with scholarships and a toolbox of habits pay cash, when you can write thank you notes and remember names, because people deserve to be seen. When I fell in love with Evan, it wasn't the ring or the promises that settled me. It was the way he wiped grease from his hands before holding our newborn, as if respect could be carried in your palms. We built a life with second-hand furniture and first-hand effort, always one good month from being steady and one bad month from slipping. I kept my work close to heart and home. While Lila napped, I drafted room plans at our kitchen table, smelling coffee and pencil shavings and the tomato soup cooling on the stove. The big firms in town had showrooms with glass walls and reception desks that gleamed. I had a file box, a measuring tape, and clients who wanted spaces that felt like they belonged to someone. We made it work until the year that didn't end cleanly, the layoff at Evan's shop, the roof leak after a February windstorm, the new client who promised payment and sent excuses instead. We tightened our belts and told ourselves it was a season the way storms pass and you find the fence still standing. Then Lila fainted during morning circle, and all the sentences in my mind went quiet, except the one that mattered. At Portland Memorial, the hallways smelled like disinfectant, and coffee left too long on a burner, and Dr. Harris spoke with the kind of patience that says he has delivered hard news many times. Congenital defect, immediate intervention. The window measured in days, not weeks. I stared at the grid of ceiling tiles and counted to 10, then 20 to keep my voice steady as we triaged our options. The hospital's plan would not touch the full bill in time. The bank wouldn't move without collateral. The friend who owed me a favor had a reason he couldn't call back until Monday. I watched Lila's lashes quiver beneath the oxygen mask and thought about the dozens of rooms I had made welcoming for other people, and how this one would never be home to anyone. When I called my parents from the parking garage, the signal echoed in the concrete, and my mother's cheerful voice from the party sounded like it was traveling across a long, cold lake. I told her we were coming over. She said she would meet me at the door. Back at the house, the difference between our worlds was loud, without anyone saying a word. The valet carts lined up beneath the porte-cochere, the fountain throwing water upward like nothing could fall here, the flowers arranged to look effortless. I thought about my father's business and the way he explained success. Right timing. The right people never show strain, and I wondered if strain could be a virtue when it meant you would not let go. My mother's hand on my elbow was feather light as she led me into the study, careful not to catch a drop from my coat on her dress. My father closed the heavy door like a judge clearing his throat. I stood by the bookshelf, palms open, and told them what the surgeon had said, and I asked for help the way you would ask for air. The room answered with the thud of bass from the party and a faint ripple of laughter. My mother's lips parted as if to speak. My father's eyes traveled to the clock on the mantel. The doorknob turned once, then stopped, as if someone on the other side remembered their cue and waited. I felt the polished floor steady under my shoes, and I kept my voice even as I said the number out loud, the one I had written on the back of a receipt in the hospital cafeteria. Beyond the walls, a microphone crackled, and a cheer rose, the sound of a toast, bright and certain. Inside the study, it was quiet enough to hear my own breath, slow and measured, while I waited for my parents to choose what mattered most. My mother's eyes darted toward the door, as if worried someone might see us standing there, me dripping rainwater onto her pristine Persian rug, her holding her breath, like she could hide the whole scene with silence. My father stood beside the fireplace, the faint reflection of party lights moving across the glass cabinet behind him. I repeated the number again, softer this time, but it sounded heavier in the air. 43,000, I said. That's what the surgery and post-op care will cost after the hospital's partial coverage. My mother lifted her chin the way she used to when she was choosing the right centerpiece for her dinner table. "You didn't plan ahead, Nora," she murmured. "That's not something you can fix by throwing numbers at us." My father folded his arms. "You've always been independent," he said. "Surely you've saved something." The words came out like an accusation, not a question. I took a shaky breath, trying to explain how we had used every dollar from my business, how Evan had cashed in part of his retirement account, how the bank needed collateral we didn't have. "She's only 7, I whispered. "Dr. Harris said we have less than 2 days to get her into surgery." My mother's face softened for a fraction of a second before her voice dropped to a whisper. "We've already committed to Carter's wedding, Nora. The deposits are non-refundable. It's been planned for months." I blinked at her, certain I had misheard. "You're telling me you can't help because of Carter's wedding?" She didn't meet my eyes. "We've already paid for the venue catering and the honeymoon package," my father said, as if reading from an invoice. 250,000. It's all contracted. We can't just undo it." My breath caught somewhere between disbelief and a slow, growing anger that I couldn't show. The faint sound of applause drifted through the wall from the ballroom, followed by Carter's easy laughter. The door opened then, and he appeared, a champagne flute in his hand and a smirk already forming. "Isn't this classic?" he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You showing up here dripping water everywhere, trying to make everything about you. Again." His fiancée Paige hovered just behind him, her diamond catching the chandelier's light. "Carter," I started, but he lifted a hand to stop me. "It's always some crisis, some emergency. You can't just plan better, can you?" My father sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "This isn't the place for this conversation," he said. "We can discuss it another time." "There isn't another time," I said quietly. "She might not make it through the weekend." My mother flinched at the bluntness, her hand flying to her pearls. "Don't be dramatic," she said. "You'll find another way. You always do." The words fell into the room like stones. I looked at them, their perfect clothes, the perfect house, and something inside me shifted. I pulled the sapphire bracelet from my wrist, the one my mother used to call a promise piece. I placed it in her hand. "You once told me this would be mine someday," I said. "It already isn't." She looked down at it, confused, as I straightened. "You'll never have to worry about me showing up again." I turned toward the door, brushing past Carter's smug smile and Paige's uncomfortable glance. Behind me, I heard my father call my name, but I didn't stop. The party lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows as I stepped outside. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket, a text from Evan. "Any luck?" I looked back at the glowing house, then typed my answer. "No, but we'll find a way." When I got home, the house was dark except for the small lamp over the sink. Evan was still awake, sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by papers and bills. He looked up, and I didn't have to say anything. He knew by my face. "How much time do we have?" he asked. Dr. Harris said, 48 hours, I whispered. He nodded slowly, then pushed a small pile of envelopes toward me. "I've been calling everyone I can think of. Loans, charities, credit unions. Nobody moves that fast." I sat down across from him, my body numb, except for the ache behind my ribs. "There has to be something," I said. Evan ran a hand through his hair, his voice low. "There is. I can sell the Mustang. Johnson's been after it for years." My head snapped up. "Evan, no. That car's your father's legacy. You rebuilt it from scratch." He gave a small, weary smile. "Legacies don't matter if we lose her." At dawn, I watched from the porch as he handed the keys to Johnson. The old Mustang roared one last time before driving away, the taillights disappearing down our quiet street. By mid-morning, we had $8,000 more, but we were still $23,000 short. Every call I made after that felt like shouting into the wind. The bank turned us down again. A loan officer I'd spoken to twice before apologized for the policy. Without collateral, he said, we can't authorize a rush approval. His voice was polite, practiced, and empty. I hung up the phone and leaned against the refrigerator, eyes fixed on Lila's drawings pinned beneath magnets, stick figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun. "I love Mommy," she had written in pink crayon, her letters uneven but full of life. My hands covered my face, and for a moment the sound that came out didn't sound like mine. Evan wrapped his arms around me, steady and warm. "We'll find a way," he murmured. "We always do." The doorbell rang before sunrise the next morning. I opened the door to find Frank and Ruth standing there, travel mugs in hand, faces drawn and tired. "Can we come in?" Frank asked quietly. I nodded, too stunned to speak. They settled on the couch, the same spot where Lila liked to build her blanket forts. "We heard what's happening," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "Mark called us last night. I realized she meant Evan." "How is she?" Frank asked. "She's stable for now," I said, "but not for long." They looked at each other. Then Frank reached for Ruth's hand. "We sold the cabin," he said. My head lifted sharply. "What?" He nodded once. "Got a decent offer this week. We were planning to use it for retirement, but that can wait. Family comes first." Ruth opened her purse and took out an envelope, setting it on the coffee table between us. Inside was a cashier's check, $38,000. "This should cover what's left," she said. For a moment, all I could do was stare. My throat burned and my words tangled somewhere between gratitude and disbelief. Evan sank onto the couch beside them. "You can't do this," he said quietly. "We just did," Frank replied. "That's what family's for." 2 days later, Lila was prepped for surgery. The waiting room at Portland Memorial was cold, the kind of cold that seeps through layers of clothing and time. I held her stuffed rabbit close while the nurse explained procedures I barely heard. Evan signed the last of the paperwork with a trembling hand. Frank and Ruth sat nearby, passing a thermos of coffee between them, their calm presence grounding the hours that followed. 10 hours passed, then 12. When Dr. Harris finally appeared, his mask still hanging from one ear, I couldn't breathe. His eyes crinkled above the lines of exhaustion. "She's going to be fine," he said. The air left my body all at once, replaced by tears I couldn't stop. A week later, Lila's room was filled with sunlight and the steady rhythm of recovery. Frank taught her to cast an imaginary fishing line from the bed rail. Ruth brought soup and stories every afternoon. My parents didn't visit. Instead, I received a single cream envelope in the mail, addressed only to me, a wedding invitation. No mention of Evan. No mention of Lila. I pinned the invitation to the bulletin board in our kitchen next to Lila's drawings. It wasn't bitterness that held it there, just proof. Proof of where the lines had been drawn and of who had crossed them when it mattered most. That night, as I watched my daughter sleep, her color returning and her small chest rising evenly, I promised myself that one day we would stand on our own again. But first, we had to survive this. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the blinds, and I caught the faint smell of coffee drifting in from the kitchen. Ruth's laughter floated down the hall mixed with Lila's giggles. I paused in the doorway and took it, in the sound of ordinary love, steady and real. I didn't know what the future would hold, but I knew this: the people sitting in my kitchen had given me something my own parents never could. The feeling of being safe. And that was enough to keep me moving forward toward whatever came next. The beeping of the heart monitor became the rhythm of our days. Every morning began the same way, nurses moving quietly around Lila's bed, sunlight filtering through blinds, Evan standing by the window with his hands tucked in his pockets. The sharp scent of antiseptic hung in the air, and the steady hum of machines made conversation sound fragile. Lila's chest rose and fell beneath a tangle of tubes, and each breath felt like a small victory we had to earn again and again. Frank and Ruth never missed a day. They brought coffee sandwiches and the kind of patience that only comes from people who have weathered harder storms. By the end of the second week, Lila started to smile again. It wasn't wide or loud, just the faint curve of her mouth when she opened her eyes and saw us standing there. Ruth leaned in close, whispering stories about fishing trips and birthday cakes until Lila drifted back to sleep. Frank read aloud from an old storybook he'd saved from Evan's childhood, his voice low and rough but steady enough to hold the room together. They stayed through every shift change, through every update that began with cautious optimism and ended with quiet hope. I hadn't heard from my parents since the night of the engagement party. Not a call, not a message, not even a question about their granddaughter. But the silence was a kind of answer in itself. A week later, when Lila was strong enough to sit up for short periods, the hospital mailroom called about a delivery. Inside a padded envelope was a wedding invitation, cream cardstock with gold lettering. My name was printed alone. There was no mention of Evan, no space for Lila. I placed it in my purse and never spoke of it. The days blended together after that. Between work emails, hospital meals, and insurance paperwork, time felt suspended. Evan took shifts at the garage when he could, but most nights he fell asleep in the chair beside Lila's bed. I spent the hours sketching designs in a notebook balanced on my knees, half distraction, half survival. When the nurses dimmed the lights at night, I'd look out the window at the city below, the red glow of brake lights trailing across the freeway, and wonder how many people passed that hospital, never knowing what was happening inside its walls. Dr. Harris stopped by one morning with good news. Lila's vitals were stable enough for discharge within the week. Ruth cried quietly behind him, her hand pressed to her heart. Evan leaned forward, his relief spilling out in a laugh that sounded like it came from somewhere deep. When the discharge papers were finally signed, Frank lifted Lila into his arms like she weighed nothing at all. The nurse gave us a packet of medication instructions thicker than a novel, and Evan promised to learn them by heart. Home didn't feel the same at first. The sound of the refrigerator, the light through the curtains, even the smell of our laundry soap, everything seemed louder, sharper. Frank and Ruth turned our living room into a little sanctuary. They built a ramp at the front steps, moved furniture to make space for the medical equipment, and cooked enough soup to fill every container we owned. Lila's laughter returned slowly, breaking through like sunlight after rain. Sometimes she'd sit at the kitchen table drawing pictures of her grandparents and pretending to teach them about art. Frank would play along, nodding seriously as she showed him how to draw hearts the right way. Weeks passed, and Lila grew stronger. I began working part-time again, meeting clients between her therapy appointments. The bills still came faster than I could open them, but we managed. What we couldn't pay immediately, we planned for later. What couldn't wait, Frank and Ruth quietly covered without ever mentioning it. Every small act of generosity felt like another stitch holding our world together. Then, one afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Carter. "Mom wants to know if Lila made it through surgery." Beneath it was another message. "Dad says you caused a scene at the engagement party." I stared at the words until they blurred. Before I could respond, a voicemail appeared from my father. His voice sounded composed but clipped. "Your behavior that night was unacceptable, Nora. We've heard about your situation, but the way you handled it reflected poorly on this family. It's best if you take some time before reaching out again." I deleted the message without listening to the rest. There were no words left that could make sense of that kind of distance. That evening, while Evan was putting Lila to bed, Ruth stopped by with another casserole and a quiet smile. "You holding up, sweetheart?" she asked. I nodded, though the lump in my throat made it hard to answer. "You remind me of my mother," I said finally. "She used to bake on Sundays." Ruth smiled softly. "Then we'll keep baking. For her, for us, for Lila." A few weeks later, spring came to Portland in bursts, pink cherry blossoms outside the window, the air thick with rain and renewal. Frank built Lila a small wooden swing in the backyard, sanding the seat smooth so it wouldn't catch on her healing scar. She'd grip the ropes, her hair flying behind her, shouting, "Push higher, Grandpa!" Each time she laughed, something inside me loosened. Our life was still fragile, but it was ours again. The living room carried the smell of sawdust and stew. My sketchbooks filled with new ideas, bright colors, open spaces, warmth. I began dreaming about rebuilding my business from home, maybe even opening a small studio someday. Evan would listen as I talked through plans, nodding like he could already see them coming to life. "You'll get there," he'd say. "You've got the drive." One night after Lila had fallen asleep, I sat at the kitchen table sorting through hospital paperwork. The unpaid balances, the itemized statements, the insurance appeals, it all looked impossible. I pressed my palms against the cool surface of the table and took a breath. That's when Evan slid an envelope across to me. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a check from the local auto shop where he'd been helping part-time. "They're expanding," he said, "offered me a manager role. Better pay, better hours." His eyes were tired, but hopeful. I reached for his hand. "We're going to make it," I said. He nodded, but the weight in his gaze told me he was still doing the math in his head. The next morning, as the first sunlight crept across the living room, I found Lila sitting in her pajamas drawing again. This time, the page showed 5 stick figures under a yellow sun me Evan, her Frank and Ruth. She had drawn little hearts around all of us. "Who's this?" I asked, pointing at the figure beside her. "Grandpa Frank," she said proudly. "He taught me how to make the hearts even." I smiled, tracing the outline with my finger. The paper was wrinkled from her small hands, but it was perfect in every way that mattered. I tacked it onto the refrigerator beside the others, right where the morning light could hit it. That evening, the mail arrived in a small stack on the counter. Among the bills was another cream envelope with gold edges, a reminder of the world I had stepped away from. I didn't open it. Instead, I looked out the window at the yard, where Lila and Frank were building another fort from blankets and chair legs. Ruth was sitting nearby, snapping beans for dinner. Evan was laughing as Lila tried to hang a flashlight from the fort's entrance. The quiet joy in that scene filled the space where disappointment used to live. And as the sun slipped below the horizon, I knew we had survived the hardest part. What lay ahead would not be easy. Money was tight, the business uncertain, but we had something far more solid than what my parents had ever offered a family that showed up. I didn't know then that our small victories were only the beginning, or that new opportunities and new tests were waiting just around the corner. But that night, as I turned off the kitchen light and watched the silhouettes of the people I loved through the window, I understood something simple and true. The worst had passed, and the rebuilding had quietly begun. By early summer, Lila's laughter filled the apartment again, soft at first, then brighter each day. The scar across her chest faded from red to pale pink, a line of proof that she'd fought and won. I worked late into the nights after she went to bed, sketching ideas for clients and drafting proposals at the kitchen table. The numbers never stretched far enough, but we were moving forward one project and one invoice at a time. Still, I could feel how thin the ground was beneath us, one emergency away from slipping back into the dark. One morning, I found a message in my inbox that made my hands shake. A Portland boutique hotel group, Westbrook Hospitality, was seeking bids for a full redesign of their 7 properties. The project was valued at nearly $2 million, an impossible number for someone like me. But the posting didn't specify firm size, only vision and execution. I read that line 3 times before opening a blank document and typing Proposal Bennett Interiors. I didn't even have a logo yet. That night I told Evan about it while we washed dishes. "They'll never pick me," I said, rinsing a plate. "I don't have the resources or the staff." He dried the dish slowly, then set it down. "You have something they don't," he said. "You make people feel like they belong somewhere. That's worth more than any firm name." His certainty was quiet but solid, the same kind that had held us steady through everything else. I spent the next week building a presentation from scratch. Ruth stopped by every morning with coffee, whispering encouragement like prayers. Frank took over grandparent duty, turning our living room into a playground for Lila, while I turned the kitchen into an office. By the time the presentation day arrived, I had slept less than 4 hours, but had something that looked real mock-ups, sketches, samples, and a vision board I could barely afford to print. When I walked into the Westbrook conference room, the air felt different, cool, deliberate, expensive. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the downtown skyline, and 5 executives in gray suits sat behind a polished oak table. The man at the center introduced himself as Michael Westbrook. "We appreciate you coming, Mrs. Bennett," he said, glancing down at my slim folder. "Your firm seems modest." I met his gaze. "It's small," I said, "but it's personal." My voice steadied as I began to speak. I told them how hotels aren't just for sleeping, they're for living, for celebrating grieving, reconnecting. I showed them spaces I'd designed for families and small businesses, places where comfort mattered as much as style. They flipped through my renderings in silence. I could feel the weight of their hesitation. I wasn't what they expected. Halfway through, I pulled out a photo of Frank and Ruth's cabin. "This was my most meaningful project," I said. "My in-laws sold this cabin to help pay for my daughter's heart surgery. After she recovered, I redesigned their new home as a thank you." The room stilled. I showed before and after pictures, the handcrafted shelves for Ruth's cookbooks, the wide windows for Frank's birdwatching, the kitchen island built for family meals. "I don't design for profit margins," I said. "I design for the people who will make memories there." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Michael leaned back in his chair. "Why do you think you deserve this contract, Mrs. Bennett?" he asked finally. The question felt heavier than it sounded. I took a breath, thinking of Lila asleep at home, of Evan's hands rebuilding that Mustang, of the nights Ruth stayed up with soup and quiet prayers. "Because I've learned what matters," I said, "and that's what I build around." When I left the meeting, the sky was turning gray and the air smelled like rain. I walked to the parking garage without checking my phone, too drained to hope. By the time I reached home, Lila was already in bed, her small nightlight glowing in the corner. Evan looked up from the couch, searching my face. "How'd it go?" he asked. I shrugged. "They were polite," I said, "but I'm not holding my breath." He nodded, but his smile didn't fade. "Doesn't matter. You showed up." 3 days later, I was washing dishes when my phone buzzed on the counter. The email header read, "Westbrook Hotels Project Decision Notice." I wiped my hands, opened it, and read each word twice to make sure it was real. They'd accepted my proposal. The contract was set to begin the following week. I covered my mouth to keep from shouting, but the sound that came out was still half laugh, half sob. Evan rushed in from the other room, and when he saw my face, he grabbed my shoulders. "Tell me," he said. I turned the screen toward him. His shout startled Lila awake, and within seconds she was running into the kitchen giggling as Evan spun me in circles. That night, after the house was quiet again, I sat at the table with the signed contract beside me. The numbers still didn't feel real. I thought about everything that had brought me here, the rejections, the coldness of my parents' house, the steady kindness of Frank and Ruth, and realized I wasn't the same woman who had stood in that marble foyer begging for help. Something had shifted. 6 months later, I stood outside a new glass door with Bennett Design Studio etched in frosted letters. Inside, 3 designers worked at desks I'd built with Frank's help. Evan handled the books, Ruth kept the coffee pot full, and Frank dropped by every week to fix something that wasn't broken. The work was constant, the deadlines relentless, but for the first time the fear of falling had been replaced with purpose. One afternoon, a text from Carter flashed across my phone. "Mom and Dad are proud of you. They're talking about reaching out." I read it once, then deleted it. There was nothing to say. The distance between us no longer hurt. It simply existed. When I came home that evening, the smell of tomato sauce filled the kitchen. Lila was perched on a stool beside Ruth, stirring a pot half her size. "Grandpa says we can have ice cream after dinner," she announced. Frank grinned from the stove. "Only if you eat your spaghetti first." Evan winked at me across the room, and I felt the simple, solid warmth of a life rebuilt, one act of love at a time. Later, after Lila had gone to bed, I sat on the porch with Evan, the night air cool and still. The stars were faint behind the city glow, but I could make out a few. "You did it," he said quietly. I smiled. "No," I said. "We did." I didn't know that night how much attention the Westbrook project would bring, or that my parents' world would soon intersect with mine again under very different circumstances. For now, I just let the quiet sit between us, steady and full, like the pause before the next chapter of our lives began. By the time the Westbrook project entered its final phase, I was working longer hours than I had in years. My studio hummed with new energy samples, stacked on tables, sketches taped to the walls, the smell of coffee and sawdust always in the air. Evan built shelving for the office himself, saying the space needed a bit of us in it. Frank and Ruth stopped by most afternoons with dinner, claiming it was for Lila, though half of it ended up feeding the staff. The studio was small, but it pulsed with the kind of life I had once only imagined. Lila had grown stronger, too. Her laughter carried down the hall when she came by after school, her backpack bouncing as she ran straight to my desk. "Mommy, Grandpa's teaching me to whistle," she announced one afternoon, her lips puckered and her effort comically serious. Frank leaned in the doorway, smiling with the quiet pride of a man who'd found joy again through a child's recovery. I paused my design work, letting myself just watch them, the grandfather who gave everything, and the little girl who now lived because of it. Money was still tight, but for the first time the strain didn't feel hopeless. The first payments from Westbrook came through enough to cover our debts and start saving. I hired 2 part-time designers, both women who had left larger firms after struggling to balance work and family. If we're going to grow, I told Evan one night, we're going to do it the right way. He smiled, nodding. Build it like you built everything else honestly. That fall, Mr. Westbrook invited me to present at the grand opening of their flagship hotel downtown. It was my design from ceiling to floor, muted coastal tones, reclaimed wood accents, soft light that made the lobby glow like late afternoon sun. As guests streamed in, Michael introduced me to the board. "This is the woman who redefined what comfort looks like," he said. I shook hands, answered questions, and tried to ignore the small voice that still whispered, I didn't belong in rooms like this. Later that evening, after the ribbon cutting, I stepped outside for air. The city lights stretched across the water, and for a brief moment, I thought about the years spent fighting for every inch of progress. Evan joined me, 2 champagne glasses in hand. "To late nights," he said. "And second chances." We clinked glasses, watching the reflection of the hotel shimmer in the river. Over the next few months, the studio grew steadily. Word spread about our work, and we began getting calls from hospitals and schools asking for designs that felt human. I didn't set out to specialize in healing spaces, but somehow that's what people saw in my work. Maybe it was because I finally understood what it meant to need one. Then came an email from a journalist writing a feature on local women entrepreneurs. I hesitated at first, but when she asked about what inspired my approach to design, I answered honestly. "It came from the hardest season of my life," I said. "When my daughter needed heart surgery, and I learned who would stand by me and who would not." I didn't name names or point fingers, just told the truth about how community had carried us. When the article went online, it spread faster than I expected. Clients called to congratulate me. A few old acquaintances reached out with kind words. But a week later, I received a message I hadn't anticipated from my brother Carter. "Mom says you made her sound heartless in that interview." I stared at the text, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "I didn't say anything about her," I replied. "Maybe she heard what she needed to." 2 days later, I got another message, this time from Paige. "Just so you know, your parents read everything. They're embarrassed, but also curious about you. They asked if the studio is really doing that well." I didn't respond. Some silences are better left unbroken. By winter, our business had expanded beyond Portland. I signed a contract to design a healthcare facility in Seattle, a project that would double our team and test every limit I had. Evan offered to cut back his hours at the shop to help with the logistics. Frank and Ruth promised to manage school pickups for Lila. Our family wasn't large, but it worked like one beating heart. The day we opened the Seattle office, I received another text from Carter. "Mom wants to come see the studio," it read. "Dad, too." For a long moment, I just stared at the words. I hadn't seen them since the night I'd left their house in the rain. 1,000 memories surfaced at once. The chandelier, the champagne glasses, my mother's pearls flashing, as she told me, "Not now." I deleted the message. There was no part of that world I wanted back. That weekend, we celebrated the new branch with a small dinner at home. Ruth made pot roast, Frank grilled vegetables, and Lila hung a hand-painted sign that read, "Congratulations, Mommy," in wobbly blue letters. We ate around the same worn table where I had once sorted overdue bills. When Evan raised his glass to toast, I looked around and realized that every person in that room had chosen to be there not out of obligation, but love. After dinner, Ruth handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a fountain pen with my initials engraved along the barrel. "Every architect needs a signature," she said. I blinked against the tears forming in my eyes. "I'm not an architect," I said softly. "You're something better," she replied. "You build lives." The following week, I was invited to speak at a local business forum. It was the kind of event my parents used to attend, expensive, exclusive, all polished edges and practiced smiles. The irony didn't escape me. As I walked to the podium, I spotted a few familiar faces from the old social circle my parents had guarded so fiercely. They smiled politely, as if trying to remember where they knew me from. When I began to speak, my voice didn't shake. I talked about resilience, about how adversity can shape you into something steadier. I mentioned the Westbrook Project, my team, and the families who had supported me. I didn't mention my parents. I didn't need to. The silence of their absence said enough. Afterward, as the crowd dispersed, a woman in a navy blazer approached. "You're Richard Palmer's daughter, aren't you?" she asked, her tone careful. I nodded once. She hesitated before adding, "Your parents must be so proud." I smiled politely. "They haven't said." That night, driving home, I caught sight of the skyline glowing against the dark. The city that had once felt too big for me now looked like something I belonged to. When I turned onto our street, the lights from our living room windows spilled across the driveway. Inside, I could hear Lila's laughter through the glass, Evan's low hum as he read her a bedtime story. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth of that sound settle deep in my chest. Everything that mattered was on the other side of that door. What I didn't know yet was that the next time my parents and I crossed paths, it wouldn't be because they wanted reconciliation. It would be because they needed something I never thought they'd ask for. The article that changed everything began with a single phone call from a local magazine editor. She wanted to feature my firm in a piece about women who rebuilt their careers from scratch. I didn't expect much from it, just another small human interest story, but when it ran, everything shifted. The headline read, "Rising from the Ashes: How Tragedy Inspired a Design Revolution." Beneath it was my photo in the studio, Lila's crayon drawing pinned to the wall behind me. Within hours, the story spread across social media. Clients sent congratulations. Old colleagues reached out after years of silence. The magazine's website crashed from traffic, and by the end of the week, I had 3 podcast invitations and an offer from a national design show. The piece focused on the projects, but near the end, one quote stood out. "My daughter's heart surgery taught me what real support looks like and what it doesn't." When I first read those words in print, I didn't think about my parents, but others did. Elaine Withers, one of my mother's longtime acquaintances, called me directly. "I thought you should know," she said quietly, "your parents didn't come to the spring charity gala." They pulled up, saw the Hendersons, then turned around. "People are talking." I thanked her, unsure what else to say. When I hung up, I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet kind of closure I hadn't expected. 2 days later, a text from Paige appeared. "Is it true about your parents refusing to help?" I didn't answer. Another message followed that evening from Carter. "Mom says you exaggerated. Dad says you're ruining the family name." I set the phone down and went back to Lila's piano practice, the gentle notes washing over the noise of old accusations. The following week, Michael stopped by the studio unexpectedly. He carried a folded newspaper under his arm and a grin that told me he'd read the article too. "You've started something bigger than design," he said. "People respond to honesty, Nora. Don't back away from it." He was right. The calls kept coming: business leaders, nonprofits, and even parents who'd faced medical crises of their own. I agreed to one interview, then another. A month later, Good Morning America reached out to feature our firm's healthcare designs. Their producers love the mission of creating spaces that heal. I flew to New York for the taping nerves humming beneath my calm exterior. When the interviewer asked about our employee healthcare policy, which cost nearly twice the industry standard, I told her the truth. Some costs are investments, not expenses, I said. I know what it's like to sit in a hospital hallway and count dollars instead of blessings. The segment aired nationwide. Overnight, my inbox filled with new clients and messages from people who said our story had given them hope. Frank and Ruth watched the broadcast from home with Lila, who proudly pointed at the screen and shouted, "That's my mom!" But not everyone celebrated. A week later, Carter's voice appeared on my voicemail. "Blake, sorry. My boss said he can't promote me after your little stunt," he said bitterly. "He thinks I lack judgment. You've humiliated this family. I listened to it once, then deleted it. There was nothing left to fix between us." Meanwhile, I learned that Palmer Furnishings, my father's business, was losing major contracts. Elaine Withers mentioned in another call that several corporate clients had quietly withdrawn. "They're saying your father's reputation took a hit after the article," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, dear." Her voice carried more curiosity than concern. I thanked her again and let the silence answer for me. That same evening, Evan found me sitting on the porch after dinner, my laptop still open beside me. "Another message from your mother?" he asked. I shook my head. "Just old acquaintances checking in." He sat beside me, his hand covering mine. "You don't have to carry their guilt anymore," he said. I looked at him, then realizing that he was right. Their downfall wasn't mine to own. By summer, the business had doubled in size. We opened offices in Denver and San Diego, and our team had grown to 16 employees. The Good Morning America segment brought national recognition, but it was the work itself that kept me grounded, designing children's hospitals, rehabilitation centers, and family housing near medical campuses. Each blueprint felt like another way to give back what we'd once needed. When the Heart Foundation approached me about partnering on a fundraiser for pediatric surgeries, I agreed without hesitation. The event was held in a downtown ballroom draped in red and gold, with Frank giving a heartfelt speech about second chances. His voice cracked when he thanked the doctors, the donors, and the woman who turned a crisis into community. Ruth stood beside him, snapping photos through tears. That night, we raised enough to fund 12 children's surgeries. Watching the donations total climb on the projector screen, I thought of the envelope Frank and Ruth had once laid on our coffee table, their life savings traded for Lila's future. The circle had closed, but this time it opened wider. A few weeks later, I signed the papers for our new home. It sat on 3 acres outside the city, plenty of space for Lila to roam, and for Frank and Ruth to have their own suite on the east wing. When the movers finished, Lila ran through each room in awe, her laughter echoing off the bare walls. "We get to see Grandma and Grandpa every day," she shouted, wrapping herself around Frank's leg. Evan smiled from the doorway, eyes shining. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary again. Mornings began with coffee on the porch, the scent of pine in the air, and Lila's music drifting from the den. Work was still demanding, but the weight I carried felt lighter. Then one quiet afternoon, a notification popped up on my phone. It was a message from Lauren Carter's wife. "I read your article again. It gave me courage. I filed for divorce yesterday." I blinked at the screen, rereading her words. She wrote that she had started a therapy practice funded partly by a grant from our foundation, and that she was finally finding her own way forward. That night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Evan and I stood on the back porch, glasses of wine in hand. The horizon glowed in shades of gold and rose. "You built this," he said softly. "All of it." I leaned against him, the air warm and still. "We built it," I said. A week later, an email arrived from a realtor friend. The subject line read simply, "Foreclosure notice." Attached was a photo of my parents' house, empty windows, overgrown lawn, the same marble foyer where I had once begged for my daughter's life. The sight stirred nothing in me. No triumph, no anger, just quiet understanding. I thought that would be the end of it. But a month later, the calls started first from my mother, then my father. Their voices tight and strained. I ignored them at first, then stopped checking voicemail altogether. Until one night close to midnight, my phone lit up again. It was my father. His voice cracked through the speaker, thinner than I remembered. "Nora, please," he said. "We have nowhere else to turn." The message ended with silence, followed by the faint sound of him exhaling, as if he'd been holding his breath for years. I sat in the dark, listening to that message twice before setting the phone face down on the table. The porch light flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. I didn't know what I would do yet, only that the balance of our story had finally shifted. When morning came, the sun broke through the trees in soft ribbons of gold, and I realized the next chapter would no longer be about forgiveness. It would be about freedom. The morning my parents came to my office, the air felt heavier than usual. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, stretching across the marble floor and catching on the edges of framed awards. I had known this day might come, but not like this. My assistant buzzed in over the intercom. "Mrs. Bennett, your parents are here." Her voice was cautious, as though she could feel the tension even through the speaker. I took a deep breath before saying, "Send them in." When the doors opened, I barely recognized them. My father's shoulders had rounded his silver hair thinner than I remembered. My mother's once precise makeup couldn't hide the strain in her eyes. She clutched a worn handbag that looked out of place in the modern office. They paused near the entrance, their gaze sweeping the room, the polished furniture, the city view, the success that had grown out of everything they once dismissed. "Thank you for seeing us, Nora." My father began, his voice rough around the edges. "You've built quite a life here." My mother nodded quickly, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The article in Forbes was lovely," she said, her tone fragile but deliberate. "We're so proud of you." I gestured toward the chairs across from my desk. "Sit down," I said. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of traffic outside. My father leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "We're in some trouble," he said finally. "The bank foreclosed on the house. The business went under months ago. We've lost almost everything." My mother looked at me with pleading eyes. "Your father's health hasn't been great, and the stress—" Her voice faltered. "We thought maybe you could help, just until we get back on our feet." I studied them quietly, my mind replaying the night I had stood in their study begging for help. Lila's surgery days away, my father checking his watch, my mother worrying about party guests. How much I asked. My father hesitated. 80,000 would clear the debt, he said. It would let us start fresh. "We're not asking for charity." His words were practiced, almost rehearsed. My mother straightened her shoulders. "We're still your parents, Nora. Family should help each other." The silence between us stretched thin. I turned to the photos on my desk, Lila smiling with a fishing pole, Frank and Ruth beside her, all three laughing under a summer sky. Next to them sat a frame from the Heart Foundation Gala, the moment Frank had called me his daughter in front of hundreds of guests. I faced them again. "Do you remember the night I came to you about Lila's surgery?" My mother blinked rapidly. "Nora, that was years ago. You have to understand it was poor timing." "You said you couldn't help because of Carter's wedding," I said evenly. My father's jaw tightened. We didn't understand how serious it was. "You didn't explain." I reached into my desk drawer and pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I played an old voicemail on speaker. My father's voice filled the office. "Your irresponsible financial choices aren't our problem, Nora. You make the family look bad. Maybe you should learn from your brother." The recording ended in silence that felt deafening. My mother's hand trembled. My father looked away. "Did you ever visit her?" I asked quietly. "Lila was in the hospital for 3 weeks. Did either of you come?" My mother's tears slipped down her cheeks. "We didn't know what to say." "You didn't need to say anything," I replied. "You just needed to show up." For a long moment, none of us spoke. The city noise outside faded beneath the sound of my heartbeat. Then I stood and slid a leather briefcase across the desk toward them. My father hesitated before unlatching it. Inside was neat stacked cash. His eyes widened. "Nora, what is this $80,000, I said. "Exactly what you need." My mother's lips parted, relief flooding her face. "Oh, sweetheart, thank you, Will." "This isn't forgiveness," I interrupted, my voice steady. "It's freedom. Mine, not yours." My father's expression faltered. "You don't mean that." "I do," I said. "I spent years believing I needed your approval to be whole. I don't anymore. This closes the debt, financial and otherwise." My mother's tears turned frantic. "Please, Nora, we're still your parents. We made mistakes, but you can't just cut us out of your life." I met her eyes. "I'm not cutting you out. I'm letting you go." They rose slowly, my father's hand gripping the briefcase like a lifeline. As they turned toward the door, their reflections wavered in the glass walls of my office, two figures walking away from everything they once valued. My mother paused briefly, her voice small. "We love you, Nora." I didn't answer. When the doors closed behind them, I stayed standing, my hands flat against the desk. The sunlight had shifted, painting the room in a muted amber glow. My gaze drifted to the photo of Lila again, her smile bright and unguarded. For the first time since that night years ago, the weight I'd carried seemed to lift, not like something taken, but something finally set down. I walked to the window, watching the city move below. People hurried across streets, headlights flickered in the distance, and for a moment, everything felt still. My father's last words echoed faintly in my mind, but they no longer had power. The fear that had once lived in me, the need to prove, to please, to earn, was gone. By the time I left the office, twilight had settled over the skyline. The air outside was cool, the streets washed in soft gold from the streetlights. I unlocked my car, then stopped, glancing back once at the building that had become both a sanctuary and a boundary line. When I reached home, Lila ran to the door barefoot, her hair still damp from her bath. "Mommy, Grandpa Frank says my piano song sounds like sunshine," she said, her grin wide. I knelt down, gathering her into my arms. Evan met my eyes over her shoulder. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He just reached for my hand, grounding me in the present. Later that night, after Lila was asleep, I stepped out onto the porch. The moon hung low, casting silver light over the lawn. Somewhere inside, Evan turned off the last lamp. The house settled around me, steady, safe, real. It struck me then that freedom didn't always arrive with noise or triumph. Sometimes it came quietly in the simple peace of knowing you had nothing left to prove. I stood there a long time, watching the stars fade one by one until the horizon began to soften with the first hint of morning light. I didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, I was ready to meet it on my own terms. The weekend after that long night on the porch, the world felt lighter. Frank was out by the grill, flipping burgers, the smell of hickory smoke drifting across the yard. Lila stood on a stool beside him, holding the spatula with both hands as he guided her through the motion. She giggled when the flames jumped, and he laughed right along with her. "You've got the touch, kiddo," he said, handing her the spatula like a trophy. Ruth was setting out plates at the picnic table, humming to herself. Evan carried lemonade from the kitchen, and I followed behind with a bowl of salad that no one would touch until the burgers were gone. The late afternoon sun spilled through the trees, painting the lawn in gold. For the first time in years, there was no edge of worry pressing against the day. Just laughter, clinking glasses, and the kind of peace that sneaks up when you finally stop chasing it. Lila ran over, cheeks flushed and bright. "Mom, Grandpa says I'm the best burger flipper in 3 states. I smiled. "Only 3. She grinned wider. "Okay, 5. Evan caught my eye across the yard, his expression warm and knowing. That look between us said everything: how far we'd come, how much we'd built together out of the pieces that once broke us. After dinner, the neighbors joined us with an apple pie. The kids chased fireflies while the adults lingered over coffee and easy conversation. When the sky turned violet, Lila tugged at my sleeve, a sheet of paper in her hand. "I made us," she said proudly. 5 figures drawn in crayon stood beneath a big yellow sun. Evan, me, Lila, Frank, and Ruth, each one smiling, their hands linked in a row. "It's beautiful," I told her. She studied it for a moment, then frowned. "Mom, how come I only have 1 grandma and 1 grandpa?" The question hit softly but deep. I knelt beside her, brushing a curl from her face. "Family isn't just about who you're born to, sweetheart. It's about who shows up no matter what." Her little brow furrowed as she thought it over. "Like Grandpa Frank and Grandma Ruth did." "Exactly," I said. She nodded, satisfied, then ran back toward the porch to show them the drawing. When the house grew quiet later that night, Evan handed me an envelope that had come in the mail. The return address read, Lauren Palmer. Inside was a thank you card, simple, handwritten. She said the foundation grant had helped her open her therapy practice, and that she was finally doing something meaningful. At the bottom she'd written, "I used to think strength looked like never breaking. You taught me that it's about rebuilding instead." I set the card down, a wave of calm washing through me. Some chapters end not with bitterness, but with understanding. Word eventually reached me that my parents had moved into a small apartment near the edge of town. My father's company was gone, their mansion sold off in foreclosure. There were rumors of health problems and unpaid debts. I didn't feel anger or triumph or pity, just distance. Whatever lesson life had handed them, it wasn't mine to interpret. Months later, I stood in the park across from our studio during our company's summer picnic. 50 employees and their families gathered under a banner that read, "Winter's Design Building Spaces That Heal." Children played tag between picnic tables, and the air buzzed with easy laughter. Lila sat at a small piano Frank had bought her last Christmas, her fingers moving confidently across the keys. The sound was light and sure, the kind of music that feels like sunlight. Ruth clapped in rhythm beside her proud tears, glinting in her eyes. I thought about the journey that had brought us here, the nights I spent at hospital bedsides, the fear, the rejection, the quiet moments that shaped me more than any victory could. I once believed justice would come as payback, that closure meant watching the people who hurt me fall. But I learned that true justice is peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else's loss, only on your own growth. When the music ended, Lila turned toward me, her face glowing. "Did you like it, Mommy?" she asked. I smiled. It was perfect. She ran to me, wrapping her small arms around my waist. In that embrace, everything that had ever been broken found its place again. As the sun slipped behind the trees, fireflies began to glow in the tall grass. The laughter around me softened into a low, content hum. I looked at the faces gathered there, my family, my team, the people who had stood beside me when the world felt cruel, and I knew that this was what survival really looked like. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of love. If you've ever had to rebuild after being let down by the people who should have protected you, remember this family isn't always the ones who share your blood. It's the ones who show up when it counts. And sometimes the best kind of revenge is simply living a life so full that the past can't reach you anymore. Take a moment to think about the people who stood beside you when things were hardest. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Because sometimes the reminder that love can begin again is all someone needs to keep going.